So I recently saw Avengers Endgame. Going in, coupled with The Incredibles 2, it was probably the most excited I've ever been to see any film. I wanted a stupendous lot out of it, and even still, it was one of the greatest films I've ever seen. After 11 years and 22 movies of build-up and storytelling, this was an utterly triumphant end to one of the most intricate and elaborate universes ever presented in fiction. Just to get some negatives out of the way quickly, the main device introduced to progress the plot is one that feels rushed into the script, and going into the main plan for the movie, there's a character that needlessly and stupidly withholds highly valuable information from the rest of the characters. That made no sense. The rules set for the plot device are fairly consistent but feel as if they can bend for the sake of particular moments, but that's pretty much a given when dealing with such specific ideas for a film that caps off the most profitable franchise in cinematic history. It also feels like Endgame is really desperate to cram an insane amount of plot and fan service into the 2 hours after its first act. Pacing can suffer as a result of this. I had a conversation with my drama teacher who said that he would have much preferred the movie if it were in 2 parts rather than 1, and I completely agree. There's a definite point in it that I feel would be a great point to leave off, and if they did do a second part, this would not only give further room for more unique moments of character interaction, but it would also allow the final battle of the movie to go on for a time longer, after it somewhat disappointingly only went on for between a quarter of an hour to 20 minutes. If it had gone on for 40, similar to the length of the Battle of Wakanda from Endgame's predecessor but with a tighter focus on the fighting itself, this would have more completely done the franchise justice, potentially being followed by half an hour or so of wrap-up and aftermath, as Endgame's post-battle cool-off sequence only lasts 15 minutes. Now I'm going to do what I've wanted to do for quite a while and just tell you why I adore this movie. The thing that fascinates me so much about Endgame is how unique it is. Operating on a very specific and intentional 1 hour to an act, 3-act structure, its first hour especially is so unlike anything else in both the MCU and superhero cinema in general, wherein the colour palette, emotive music and pacing of scenes emit this heavy tone of genuine hopelessness and despair. Of course, the characters clamber to piece plans together, but you still get the impression that most of it is done out of stubborn heroism rather than genuine belief in the success of their endeavours. This segment of the movie really does move quite slowly, and I'm not sure if this is just my recent binge of the first 5 seasons of Game of Thrones that's got me into slow burn storytelling, but I delighted in the fact that it took its time and we got a nuanced approach at presenting the progression of a superhero plot. The second act had its emphasis placed on humour and story progression. Generally this worked well, however the Russos didn't quite nail the balance of comedy in comparison to the dire seriousness of everything else. I don't think it was funnier than Infinity War, but I believe this to have worked in Endgame's favour, as it further separates itself from the status quo of the MCU. Particular scenes where the dialogue concerned integral subject matter could often feel awkwardly interrupted when a joke was interjected where it really shouldn't have been. I'm a big fan of the newer, funnier Thor from Thor Ragnarok and Infinity War, but he was effectively reduced to the status of walking punchline for the majority of this movie. A lot of his jokes hit home, but maybe 40% of them didn't and came off as jarring and misguided. Toward the third act, when I really wished he abandoned the gimmicky spiel of silly Thor and became full, badass, hammer-wielding, god of thunder Thor, it didn't feel like he was completely there, which was slightly disappointing. Speaking of said third act, apart from that minor oversight, there is nothing I can complain about. Genuinely, it may be the best finale to a film I've ever seen. I enjoyed it with 3 friends and we all absolutely lost our shit on several occasions. It's definitely one of the most dramatic and satisfying final acts to a film ever, right up there with excellent endings from works such as Whiplash, The Shawshank Redemption and The Truman Show. This last hour had its focus on the characters within it and the fundamental theme of closure, which they handled with expert precision. Where any other movie would take a huge event in their universe, such as the snap, and accentuate its importance with a bunch of political and global commentary, Endgame uses it to play to the emotions of the main characters and develop a personal, emotional stigma within the Avengers as a unit. And besides, the storytelling and character development had to be on point, because as of today, the 29th of April 2019, Avengers Endgame is the first and so far only movie to make me, angsty 15-year-old male that I am, get so caught up in the moment whilst watching that I cried at it. I did it twice no less, the first being the result of a debate between 2 characters at an elevated position, and without meaning to spoil, the other towards the end where a light turned off and there was a scene set at a lake. In between those 2 moments there was also a bit involving lots of yellow circles that made me cry, but with joy, so that's slightly different. Trust me, this seriously caught me off guard. I've been a semi-enthusiastic Marvel fan ever since I saw the original Avengers movie for my 9th birthday back in 2012, but beyond that I then saw Thor: The Dark World, Guardians of the Galaxy and Age of Ultron in the cinema. I've watched The Winter Soldier, Civil War, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Spider-Man Homecoming, Black Panther and Thor Ragnarok at home between then and now, but seeing Infinity War in the cinema was what really kicked my interest up a gear. I was incredibly excited for Endgame, but I never realised just how much I cared for the characters in it until the end. The fact that the movie evoked this reaction from me though, all boils down to its gradual introduction of the theme of finality, and the fact that this would be the last time we'd ever see the Avengers all fighting side by side that is so cleverly developed throughout the movie's runtime. I saw it again 2 days after release date and I cried a second time still. The idea that these characters I legitimately grew up with and have been a constant in the 15 full years of life I've had so far are gone is daunting as hell, and executed its introduction in such an emotionally impacting way. In many ways, Infinity War felt like Thanos' movie, and I feel like its sequel belongs to another character. If you think my subjective interpretation of who the focal point of this movie was is a spoiler, you're welcome to skip to the timestamp on screen and avoid it. But I felt like this movie wholeheartedly belonged to Iron Man. His story, character arc and relationships are the ones the film explores the most, and honestly I wouldn't have it any other way. Thor has always been my favourite Avenger, but after this I think Tony Stark may have just overtaken him. Also, in terms of other characters, the deuteragonist or secondary protagonist was definitely Captain America. I feel like in general the Russos prioritised the right people in terms of screen time and focus, with Ant-Man, Rocket, Nebula and most surprisingly of all, Captain Marvel and Thanos himself all taking backseat roles and predominantly serving the purpose of progressing the plot. The reason this was done is because Endgame isn't actually supposed to be the story of the Avengers vs Thanos, nor is it supposed to be interpreted as Infinity War 2. In fact, to call this movie Infinity War Part 2 would be a major disservice to it, as refreshingly, it doesn't just feel like an outright crossover movie a la Infinity War, Civil War and Age of Ultron. At its core, Endgame is an unapologetic celebration of the original 6 Avengers as a family and as characters us avid comic book fans have all fallen in love with over the past decade and a tenth. I think the MVP of Endgame would have to be Robert Downey Jr., channeling an incredible range of emotions which so starkly, no pun intended, contrast his usually laid-back demeanour of ironic detachment and quips. Second best in the movie is Paul Rudd as Ant-Man, proving himself to be not only hilarious as the sandwich-eating pop-culture-obsessed quip machine that is Scott Lang, but also showing versatility as he manages to give a conspicuously grounded performance, bringing Lang to life with subtle mannerisms and habitual idiosyncrasies and pauses in speech. I'm naturally a hardcore fan of DC, not for its recent films but for its characters. Batman has always been my favourite superhero and The Dark Knight my favourite superhero movie, but I am currently in near constant mental debate as to whether Endgame dethrones it. On the topic of long-term mental effects, this movie has seeped its way into my subconscious ever since I saw it for the first time. It's 5 days since, and every day so far I've spent a considerable amount of time thinking and talking about it. Overall, Avengers Endgame is a first time ever, once in a generation film, amassing so many narrative threads and franchises and revitalizing superhero movies as a medium and the limits that long-term storytelling can go to in cinema. It will be remembered as a classic, as it should be. I gave Infinity War a 7.5 at the time of its release, but I have since changed it to an 8.5 as subsequent rewatches have improved my opinion on it substantially. Its continuation is an absolute victory for fans of film and superheroes alike, is the best MCU movie ever, and like nothing I have ever seen before it. It changes the game and gave us a satisfying, epic and emotionally hardwired sensation of a film to cap off the first franchise of its kind, and I don't say this lightly, but I would feel incorrect if I gave Avengers Endgame anything but a 10 out of 10.